against virus. Two men held a struggling bulldog down on a table. It was smothered by its own saliva, and a bite from its jaws might cause death. Beside them stood Louis Pasteur, holding a narrow glass tube in one hand. "Hold the head, please," he said calmly. He put one end of the tube between his lips and sucked some of the saliva up the tube. The men watched him, awestruck. If he sucked too hard and got some of the saliva in his mouth? But he did not suck too hard. After he had done that, he nodded, and the men lifted the dog and carried it back to its cage. Pasteur released the saliva into a sterile test tube and closed the mouth of the tube with cotton. Then he held it up to the light and looked at it. He had to find the rabies microbe that made dogs mad and brought people an unbearable death. He remembered how, when he was a child, a mad wolf had been abroad near his home. Everyone was afraid of being bitten by it. Several people had been and had died as a result. Then, the only way to try to stop the infection from a bite was to burn the wound by pressing a red-hot iron on it. This was said to purify the flesh. This treatment was terribly painful, but anyone who had been bitten was ready to suffer the treatment rather than suffer rabies. Pasteur still remembered the day when, as a boy, he had seen a crowd outside the blacksmith's forge near his father's house. He had run to see what was happening. The onlookers had pushed him roughly away, but not before he had heard the moans of a villager and the hiss of the blacksmith's red-hot iron on his skin. Pasteur had never been able to forget the horror of that moment. By now, Pasteur had found a cure of anthrax and chickenpox, cholera, and he was determined to find a similar treatment for rabies. That was why he had collected saliva from the jaws of a mad dog. Pasteur and his assistant Rue looked closely and for long at that saliva under a microscope, but they found no rabies germ. "I don't understand this," said Pasteur. "If a bite from a bulldog can cause rabies, the microbe must be in the saliva." "Well, we don't seem to be able to find it," said Rue. "Let's try injecting the saliva into animals and see if it gives them rabies. Then, at least we'll know if the germ is really in the saliva. We can try with blood taken from mad dogs too. Paul Bert has been doing that." "We have no chance of finding a cure if we can't find the microbe that causes it. How can we attempt to find a vaccine?" muttered Pasteur. In spite of their discouragement, he and Rue experimented with injections of saliva and blood taken from mad dogs. They found that the saliva sometimes caused rabies, but quite often it did not, and the blood had no effect at all. "Confusing," exclaimed Pasteur, walking up and down the laboratory. "I have the feeling we're on the wrong track. There has to be a rabies germ even if we can't see it. Where does it go inside the animal? It can't be in the blood, or those injections of blood would have worked." "You mean it may not travel in the blood at all?" asked Rue. It seemed strange, for every germ they had studied so far lived in the blood. "That's right," said Pasteur impatiently. "Yet, where else? Where else?" He stopped and stared at a cage that was full of rabbits. "Wait a minute," he cried suddenly. "Think of the symptoms of rabies. The mad dog rushes about, biting, foaming at the mouth. But later, months later, the poor creature becomes paralyzed and then dies." Paralysis means that not only are the muscles affected, but also the nerves that order the muscles to move. The rabies germ must affect the nervous system. I can see now. First, it makes the animal terribly excited, and then it attacks the nerves so that paralysis results. Rue, we should look in the brain and spinal cord for this germ. Eagerly, he and Rue began a series of experiments to test the new idea. They took samples from the brain of a dog that had died of rabies and injected them under the skins of experimental animals. Finally, many of them developed signs of rabies. Rue suggested that it would be better to inject the germ straight into the brain if that was where it traveled anyway. By now, they had discovered that rabbits as well as dogs could have rabies. So, they took a small piece of the brain of a rabbit that had died of rabies and injected it into the brain of another rabbit. After only 7 days, this rabbit developed rabies. This proved that the rabies germ does live in the brain. The sooner it gets there, the sooner it has an effect. Then they tested the strength of the germ by noting how quickly a rabbit developed rabies after the germ was injected into its brain. "We will use the most virulent kind in trying to make a vaccine," Pasteur announced. "Then, the vaccine is bound to be a protection against all the different strengths of the germ." The next move was to weaken the germ. Experiments with infected brains proved that the germ lived in a region of the brain called the medulla, so they used samples from there. Pasteur dried and ground up the pieces and injected them into healthy animals. But amazingly, instead of getting really sick, they rapidly recovered. When Pasteur saw what had happened, he was immediately hopeful. "It looks as if we may have found a cure for rabies," he said eagerly. "Rue, we shall conquer it." The men began the experiment to test their idea. First, they injected dogs with 14-day-old medulla. The next day, they injected 13-day-old medulla. They went on in this way until on the 14th day, they injected 1-day-old medulla, which they knew would ordinarily give their dogs rabies. It did not. Weeks later, the dogs frisked about as happily as ever. "We've done it," whispered Pasteur, hardly daring to believe it. "They are immune. They are safe."